We often forget, I think, in the process of, say, talking about globalization, the transformations that are taking place all the time, that the economies are made of real people, and these changes, these crises affect them. And the one place we acknowledge that fact is when we're talking about unemployment. But of course, unemployment is just one measure that we might be interested in. We're also interested in issues of household income, education and development, and so forth. But this talk today is going to stick with the macro issue of unemployment for the most part, although at the end, some of the sort of consequences of globalization for both income distribution as well as employment will be the subject of the talk. All right, now I know we have some technical problems up here. Well, I guess not yet. You can see that one. I tried to make the type fairly big so everybody could see it in the back of the room. But the technical problem is when we come to the graphs, and the bottom or the horizontal or the y-axis is not visible. So I'll try to remember to explain what's there, right? And if I don't, raise your hand and object, or one of those clarifying questions is in order, all right? So that's the story. Well, it's 4 years since the Great Recession at least ended in the U.S., but still employment continues to be well below trend. Not just in the U.S., but particularly in Europe, and then not just in Europe. There were global consequences of the recession. They haven't all worked themselves out, even in the developing world. The U.S., for example, is about 2% below, employment's 2% below the peak in 2005. Well, that was 5 years ago. All right, the labor force grows at over 1% a year. So 5, 6 plus 2 is 8%, or not quite, probably more like 6 or 7%. I've got a figure here of 8 million workers out of 130. We're probably 140 is where we should be. In the EU, there's been no recovery at all. In the US, there's been some recovery, slow, and indeed, unemployment continues to rise. Most of these facts you already know. I'm just going to go into more detail. So the purpose of this talk is, what's the explanation for this lack of employment recovery? Now, I'm going to be talking particularly in the developed industrial world, primarily because that's where I got the data. All right, it's very difficult to characterize what's going on in many other places. As economists, we want to rectify that problem and provide comparable data in the developing economies as well, but at this stage we just don't have it. So let me review briefly, start out by reviewing the global facts, and then I'll study the US experience in some detail, particularly the controversy over mismatch versus lack of aggregate demand that's been going on. Then move on to Europe, and there the problem is youth unemployment. Why is youth unemployment a problem in the US, or in Europe and not in the US, for example? That's a good question. In fact, unemployment at the moment is more of a problem among older workers in the US than it is among younger workers. All right, so there's some differences there that need to be talked about. Explore monetary and fiscal policy, or should I say the lack of it. All right, has the policy improved or made things worse? That's really. And then, probably after the break, spend some time on long-term trends, particularly the so-called hollowing out of the middle class in the US, and it's happening in Europe as well. What is that? All right, I'm going to argue that it's partly a consequence of globalization, but not just globalization in the sense of increased trade, but also in the sense of particularly technical change, and again, automation, the moving from more labor-intensive, capital-intensive forms of production. All right, so that's the outline. Let's get started. All right, I needed a global picture for you about global unemployment. Now, this particular one, the axis that you can't see, runs from 2002 to 2017, so there's a projection there at the end. 2013, you may be able to see it. The light-colored bars are the projections. This is the International Labor Organization. It comes from one of their recent pamphlets. Frankly, I don't know where they get this figure. All right? I just don't. I mean, I looked at it. I looked at the the background and so forth. And they make an attempt to make an estimate and then compare it. But 200 million is a lot of people, right? It's almost, well, it's not quite. All right, if you combine the labor force of the EU and the US, you come up with some number about 250 million or so. So that just gives you a comparison. But, it's a lot of people, right? Now, it's only a small fraction of the Chinese, but, of that 200 million, we know that 25 million are in the EU 27, right? And that's significant. We're all aware of that. And probably about 12 million in the US, all right? So they count for 1/3 of 1/2, right, of that total. Okay, you can see, of course, in this picture, the recession, the dip in unemployment is in the 2005 to 2008, and then the recession, as you can see. And then they're projecting a leveling off of the unemployment rate, a world unemployment rate. Okay. Now, it's probably more useful to think about decomposing the change in employment to population ratio. Okay, that's of course take the working age population, which is usually defined as, depending on what country you're in, 16 to 60. All right, varies. The smaller and the larger number varies from place to place, but that's the group we're talking about. And then we simply take the ratio of those who are gainfully employed and dividing it by the population. You don't know what the population ratio is. All right, in this picture, first of all, I should say what's on the horizontal axis. It's regions. The first column is a negative column, by the way. You see the 0 there. So we're accounting for how much employment is either going up or down from the period 2007 to 2012. The first column is the world, the second column, developed economies, the third, East Africa, the fourth, South Africa, and the fifth is Latin America. So the first observation is to note that the only place employment's grown in that period is in Latin America. All right? So the decline in the employment ratio in the world is the left column. And then that's decomposed into various components, which you can read up there: adult demographics, adult unemployment, labor force participation, youth demographics, youth unemployment, and so forth. And depending on what region we're talking about in the developed world, notice the youth unemployment is a big factor. That is the reduction in youth unemployment. Not the total issue, though, because, of course, youth is a smaller fraction than adult. The adult unemployment counts for more of it. Okay. The general point of this picture, of course, is to say that the unemployment problem is indeed global. All right? The reduction, of course, in Asia being a consequence of course, Asia being the production hub for the developed world. So the demand falling there affected them as well. Okay. This one I debate about putting this up. You can't see the bottom, and there's a lot of points there. Let me tell you what it's trying to say. You can always decompose unemployment into its two components. One is how frequently do workers become unemployed. That's job destruction, measured along the vertical axis. And the other is how long are they unemployed? All right, that's the horizontal axis. All right, along the horizontal. Roughly speaking, the unemployment is the product of how frequently people become unemployed times the length of time they're unemployed. All right? So if a tenth of the people, I go through the example, a tenth of the people are unemployed and they're unemployed for a year, then you've got, the product of those two total employment. Now, roughly speaking, then, unemployment is a rectangular hyperbola in this picture. Okay? And what the picture says is that if we plot points for different countries in 2007, we get the blue graph, which is left. And if we plot the same countries in 2011, we get the red, all right, curve. Okay, and if you look at the individual countries, you'll see what the picture really says. It says for the most part, the increase in unemployment from 7 to 11 is due to an increase in the duration of unemployment. In other words, keep the horizontal fixed, look to from the left blue curve to the right red curve. Most countries, all right, didn't have much change in job destruction, mostly, in terms of duration. Not true of all, but generally, that's the picture. Okay. Now, this is a selection of countries. Most of the European countries are there. The developed, I think it's pretty much developed countries on this particular picture. Do I see anything that's not off the top of my head? Okay. So, just my first point, the Great Recession was global. Labor market effect of the Great Recession was both a sharp rise in unemployment and a decrease in labor market participation, or more generally, a drop in the employment ratio, except for Latin America. And in the developed world, at least, the rise in unemployment is associated with longer durations, okay, rather than destruction. There was job destruction, but what really happened was the hiring margin was hit, for the most part, by the recession, and decreased that hiring margin, which made it more difficult for unemployed workers to find jobs, and hence it took a longer period of time. Okay. All right, I'm going to look at now the U.S., and the U.S. experience fits what I just said. Now this picture is the well-known, or becoming well-known, beverage curve, for most of you who are economics students who've heard of it. On the horizontal here, we have job opening rate. This is U.S. JOLTS data. The time series has actually existed only for about 12 years. And on the right axis, we have the unemployment rate. The downward, each point in the picture is a job opening rate and an unemployment rate associated with a particular month, all right, in the period 2000 to December 2000, that's the far upper right corner, left corner, and March, the latest data, time I have data, March 2013, which is the end point, somewhere there in the middle, all right? And roughly speaking, the story goes as follows. You can just, I try to explain this to non-economists. You want to think of, there's a third dimension, right? Third dimension, which has on it the year. And what we're doing is going through the years and then tracing out the projection of that three-dimensional picture onto two. If we do that, we start out In December 2000, we go through the recession of 2001. You probably can't see the colors, but those are the blue points. All right. Then, yeah, the blue points in the fall, as you can see there's November 2001. Then there's the, the recovery period after that recession, which is the red points, sorry. And they're moving up to the left as unemployment falls, back up to an unemployment rate which is slightly under 4.5, and then they're messing around. Then in 2007, all right, which also happens to be the beginning of a drop in housing prices in the U.S., their green points start, and they move down slowly in the picture until 2008, September was it, 2008? No, financial crisis. And then it plunges, vacancies fall, unemployment rises. All right? All of that movement from December 2000 to June 09. Can everyone see the June 09 point? It's important, you can see that. All right. Easily described by standard discussion of fluctuating aggregate demand and the effects of that on vacancies on the one hand, and then the effects of vacancies on unemployment. If you use the so-called MPD model, Mortensen Pissarides diamond model, it explains all that, right? This set of points is just sort of the steady state relationship or the dynamic relationship that holds between unemployment and vacancies. When vacancies go up, unemployment has to follow. All right? But then in 2009, shortly after, something seems to happen. All right? The points jump up at the at the end of the Great Recession and mess around, but then slowly move back up with the higher vacancies and lower unemployment from, well, roughly the end of the recession to today, along a different beverage curve. In the lingo of macroeconomics, which I teach all the time, apparently the beverage curve shifted. All right. Now, what did the beverage curve shift mean? It means it took, just on the face value of it, it took more vacancies to achieve a particular level of unemployment. Right? You can see that. Just look across at the picture, hold vacancies fixed, or the other way around. At a given level of vacancies, you have more unemployment. All right. So some have argued that that shift represents a structural change in the U.S. labor market. Now, before I get to that point, I'm going to talk about that point. Before I get to that, though, this picture clearly shows that unemployment durations went up significantly in the U.S. Unemployment durations are correlated 0.98 with the ratio of vacancies to unemployment, as predicted by our model, by the way. The ratio, of course, in this picture, all you mathematically oriented economists know, is the slope of the ray. All right, pick any point. It's just the slope of the ray to that point from the origin. So what clearly happened was a tremendous increase in duration, and a duration that has not anywhere near come back to where it was in the pre-recession period. If you just project here a picture or a ray through the center of those red points, all right, you see we're a long way from today, even today from that rate. All right. Any questions on this picture? My wife has a problem with it, so I did all that for her. She's seen it many times. But. Okay. has the natural rate of unemployment increased? This has been the controversy in the last, since the end of the recession, really. As I'll show you, at least since 2010. All right, here's one view by a very well-known economist, Mariana Kova, who happens to also be the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. This is a view he's changed somewhat recently, I might add, in all fairness to Mariana. But at the time, it was 2 or 3 years ago, when just first observed it, he was arguing that it's a mismatch. You can't, the recession, of course, had a big impact on the employment of construction workers, had a big impact on the employment of finance workers as well. You can't, I guess, transfer a Wall Street worker from what he does to one who, into a sector where there's excess demand for workers like tending for old people, all right? Similarly, construction workers. That's essentially social, all right? We want to look at that. There are counter-arguments. Here's one by Christina Romer, whom you know as the Obama's first head of the Economic Council of Advisors. No, Christina says it's the elevated unemployment rate reflects mainly cyclical factors, particularly the lingering shortfall of consumption spending and business investment. No doubt. Actually, just to show that there's not totally politically issue, Martin Feldstein, at least in 2011, agreed, all right, that it's lack of demand, but everybody, that's what's going on. All right. Well, these authority figures, of course, didn't resolve the debate. They simply represent the two sides. All right. So there's been quite a bit of research on this issue. Not a huge number of papers, but a significant number. Not all of which have yet been published. So I thought it'd be worth reviewing the debate today, a little bit about the debate today. All right, before I get to that, I guess I've got a draft here on, well, what are the arguments for mismatch? What are the possible sources of mismatch? Well, I just showed you the shift in the beverage curve, and many people took that, it's harder to get a particular unemployment. You need more vacancies to get a particular unemployment rate. That construction and finance industries were adversely affected. Most new jobs are health service. I've already made that point. There are other additional arguments. One is housing, so-called housing market lock. As you know, a good part of the crisis in the U.S. is associated with the mortgage market. Failures in many ways of the mortgage markets in a variety of ways, but led to a dramatic 40% drop in the prices of owner-occupied housing. That had two effects. It precipitated a large number of defaults, mortgage defaults. Mortgages are the major way in the U.S. to finance homes. But not only that, mortgages had been given quite freely before the crisis. After the drop in prices, there were 11 million mortgages underwater. By that we mean that the value of the house was less than, underwater here, than the face value of the mortgage, what you owed on it. So if you sold the house, you'd lose, negative assets as a consequence. All right, well that effect can discourage, of course, mobility of various kinds. Interregional mobility has been a major source of adjustment in the U.S. It's relatively easy for people to move. Typically, it's relatively easy for them to sell their house, go somewhere and buy another one. Not in this recession. All right, so that particular adjustment mechanism wasn't available, and some have argued that's an important issue. Finally, many argue that extended UI benefits have reduced worker search effort. I have to take some responsibility here. I wrote one of the first papers that illustrated the incentive effects of unemployment insurance were to extend duration of unemployment. And there's been ample empirical papers on that since, suggesting that's true, although the impact of unemployment insurance, at least in normal times, is not all that large, all right? But still, this certainly was a major argument made by people who had a view that the mismatch was the issue, all right? So, let me take you through this a little bit. The effect of the shift in the beverage curve was analyzed by Professor Barleby, Gaudy Lebra, a former colleague of mine and still a colleague at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, where he just simply took, if you like, the MPD model, Mortensen with Reed's model, literally, and used the data first to estimate a so-called matching function. It's a matching function that underlies these curves, and for the period before and during the recession, which are the points down there, and then simply shifted that up by the amount that the increase unemployment or the increase vacancies required at a particular unemployment rate at the beginning of the recovery. Now, this analysis was done in 2009, 2010. We're now, but it turned out to be very, very prophetic in the sense that his projected new beverage curve, the one further out to the right, is exactly the policy. It's exactly the policy that the economy has pursued ever since. We're now still on the higher curve, but up at about 7.5%. All right? Okay. Then he used that computed shift in the beverage curve, which he estimated from the data, and the curvature of the curve, which he estimated from the pre-recession data, in the following way. There's another part of the model. Basically, the model says that vacancies depend upon firm expectations about the future profitability of hiring workers, and in that profit calculation is the difficulty, the time it takes to fill a vacancy, to hire, and the cost of hiring the worker. All right, so again, using the model, he calculated and that's going to, if it becomes more expensive to hire a worker, that's going to reduce the demand for labor, and that has an impact on where we should see the economy settling down after the recovery. And his calculation is the blue ray is the market diagnosis of vacancy unemployment ratio on average during the pre-recession period. The red curve is the projected, all right, ratio of vacancies to unemployment, which I already said is 1-to-1 with duration, all right, after the recovery takes place, all right. That intersects the new curve at about roughly 6.5%. So this back of the envelope theoretical calculation suggested that the natural rate of unemployment, the rate at which the economy settles down eventually, increased from roughly 5% to 6.5%. So his calculation of the effect of the shift, if in fact there was mismatch, is about 1.5 points. That's of course out of a 5% increase in unemployment rate in the US during the recession, from 5% to 10%. All right, so roughly a third he would attribute to mismatch, and the rest to aggregate demand. Okay, as I said, that's back of the A little bit more empirical study is one by Lazier and Spletzer, where they construct what they call a mismatch index. The mismatch index is constructed as follows. For each of, let's take occupations. We've got a lot of different occupations. Let's treat each occupation as a different labor market with its own, if you like, beverage curve, its own macro or market level dynamics, all right? Then look at the market, what's called market tightness, the ratio of vacancies to unemployment, all right, in each of those various markets, all right? Then construct essentially a variance measure of that distribution, all right? How, in other words, how different is market tightness across these submarkets, all right? That's their market mismatch index. Then look at that year by year. All right, that's the curve here. On the horizontal, we have January 2005. On the left, it's not on the picture, but January 2012. So the end of last year, roughly the end of last year at the far end. And the lower curve, the shaded area is the recession period. The lower curve is the mismatch index for for industries, and so this is industries. So you look at different industries as though they have their own labor market, construct this measure of essentially the dispersion in market tightness, and look at its dynamics. So what did it do? Well, as you can see, it rose significantly during the recession, rose quite a bit. Not surprisingly, as already said, construction was badly hit, so vacancy unemployment ratio tanked there. Finance was badly hit, all right? Some industries were not, like healthcare, all right? So the dispersion increased, market tightness differences increased. But by the end of 2012, it's down to the pre-recession levels, all right? If it were mismatched, then the beverage curve should have shifted back, all right? This is the sort of point. The top one is across occupation. And there, the changes aren't as dramatic, but the story is the same. It rises during the recession, but then comes back to pre-recession levels within a couple of years. Right? So this is evidence that at least that kind of measure, mismatch is usually associated with the problem, well, you got some labor markets where there are a lot of vacancies. All right, either can't be filled, and others where too few vacancies, got a lot of workers who can't find jobs. All right, that sense, that's what they're trying to capture here. That doesn't seem to show at least where we are now. It's not, or at least it's evidence against the mismatch argument for the lack of recovery. Yeah?
Sorry, what is the difference between, so what exactly is occupation mismatch?
Occupation is what you think of. I mean, occupations are truck drivers and teachers and stenographers and so forth.
Non-industry.
Pardon?
Everything out of that industry?
No, the industry would be in there too. All right. I mean, occupations span industries. I mean, here we're talking about industries down here, but we're talking about administrative assistants, right? They're everywhere. Nurses are industry specific, but there are many. Okay. So, I mean, they're right. These two occupations and industries are not perfectly orthogonal, but we look at it a different way. Okay. So, all right. Now the other sort of extended UI benefits. UI benefits for, I don't know if we've got any Americans in the audience, but U.S. unemployment insurance is, by European standards, very niggardly. There's a maximum duration period, typically of 26 months. 26 months, what did I say? 26 weeks? 6 months. 6 months. All right? And, but that's normal times. There's an automatic extension of unemployment benefits in a state if the state unemployment rises above some threshold. Automatically, the unemployment benefits are extended. Then, if Congress sees fit, they can extend the benefits federally for everyone. And Congress did see fit in 2009 to do that, and again in 2010, so forth. And the benefit period actually went from 26 weeks to, for some people, up to 90, right? Up to almost 2 years. The last extension of UI benefits at the moment will end this summer unless Congress acts again, which I don't think they will, all right? And then they'll revert, all right? The point of this picture is to try to get as close to a controlled experiment as possible with the data here. Again, the shaded area, again we have 2005 to the dotted line, which is 2010, and then we go on another year and a half, not quite to the end of 2012. There are two groups here. We're going to say the treatment group and the control group, all right? The red line is the treatment group. These are job leavers who are UI eligible, all right? The other aspect about unemployment insurance in the U.S. is that there are a significant fraction who are not eligible. Certainly those who quit voluntarily are not eligible. All new entrants are not eligible because you have to have worked at least 2 quarters, I think, to acquire eligibility for unemployment insurance. All right, so what we'll take those to be the non-eligibles, in other words, to be the control group, the blue curve. And you can see the result, it's very obvious. Unemployment duration is what we're measuring on the horizontal axis in weeks. It goes from an average, notice, of about 15 weeks to a high on average of close to 40, but that's true of both groups. All right, so unemployment duration goes up for both groups. Okay, and then it comes down slowly. That hasn't returned to normal yet. It's still high. That's consistent with the point I already made about the beverage curve, but it's for both groups again. There's not much difference between the two. There's a slight difference between the two. If you calculate that difference, you can come up with, at most, about 0.04 or 40% of 1 percentage point, all right, attributable to extended benefits. It's assuming that the difference is all due to whether you're eligible or not. So that doesn't, that suggests that that's not an explanation of any importance. Okay, well here's a better story. These are quarter-to-quarter growth rates in real GDP. And of course we see 2009, that's a recession. There was a jump up in, at the end of 2009, associated probably with the stimulus package introduced at the beginning of 2009. Leveling off in 2010, and then jumping around, but nowhere does it approach. I mean, and the road really falls to an average of about 2% in 2011, 2012, 2013. Okay, so across the bottom we've got quarters from the second quarter of 2009 on the far left to the first quarter of 2013. All right. Now, we're going to talk about more about this in this afternoon. Typically, in the old days, after a recession, these growth rates would be from 4 to 6% on a quarterly basis. All right. Here, we get up to 4% in 2 quarters of the total, and then it's 2% or less in all the others. Just what is the consequence of that slow growth? I think Michael said something about will we ever get back to trend? This picture is exactly what he was talking about. This is the top line here. Again, we've got years on the bottom. Starts in 07, 08, 010, then the recession. Well, the end of the recession is the shaded area, which on this picture is all projected into the future. That's fine, okay? So what you see on the left, up to the little dashed line, is how far employment is below trend, all right? It was on trend at the beginning of 2008, fell below during the recession, that's the dip down. The data here ends at the second quarter of 2010, and then look at what kind of growth in GDP do you need to get employment back on trend. That's the whole point of this picture, all right? And I think it's very graphic, tells the story very well. If you had 5% growth in GDP, we'd be back, or 6% growth it is, which was not unheard of in the old days. It would have been back to trend by 2012 with 5% unemployment rate. All right. At 3% GDP growth, it takes all the way to 2020 to get back to 10. This just shows the importance of growth rate here. If you're at 2%, we've been at 2% the last 2 years, you don't catch up. All right? By 2020, the unemployment rate's 12%. All right? And that's what we've been doing. The unemployment rate's fallen. However, as I'll show you this afternoon, to a large measure, the unemployment rate's fallen because participation's fallen. All right? And as a consequence, the employment trend is, they're actually stagnating on the employment level. Yeah, question?
Do you have the same for Europe?
Unfortunately, I don't.
Can you say something?
I'm not very good at creating graphics, and yeah, I'm gonna get to Europe. All right, their problems. I think we're there. Yeah, we're there. Okay, so wait a minute. One more slide, and we'll be there. Let's just summarize what I said about the U.S. All right, you can read it yourself. Principal reason for continued low employment is low growth in aggregate demand. At least the evidence for structural change being, it's not that it wasn't there. And now structural change, I should take that away because I'm going to be talking about that later. Mismatch, right? The notion that there's some markets where there's job openings and no people, and other markets where there's people with no job openings. As a major explanation for what's going on, I think it's minimal. All right, the maximum investment I gave you is 1.5%. I think it's less than that. All right, even though that was computed with my own model. All right. Here we go. All right. This is just a comparison of. UE. I just came up with a new name for the United Europe rather than the European Union. That always happens. There's always some humorous typo that you get in here. All right. The story here, they said there's two measures of, again, we're going, it's time. We're starting at the far left in beginning of 2000. We go all the way to the first quarter of 2013 on the right. All right, so it's up to date. The colors are a little hard. Of course, Japan's on the bottom, so we'll not talk about that much. U.S. is just above that, and of course the big spike in unemployment in the U.S., you see that. And then the drop in unemployment. The other two are two different EU measures, one for EU 17, the other for EU 27. And of course, behavior of unemployment in the EU was similar to the U.S., only not as dramatic. Right? The increase in unemployment wasn't as large in percentage-wise or in absolute terms. But the big difference is unemployment's coming down in the U.S., even though it's not getting the job done, as I've just described, and it's going up in Europe. So there is no recovery if we look at the labor market in the European Union. Right? In fact, quite the opposite. Things are getting worse. Right? So what's the story? Okay. Well, before I should say, EU is aggregating across 17 countries, one case, 27 the other, and there's a lot of heterogeneity. So we're going to talk about that heterogeneity. Along the way, however, I'm going to make a particular point about one particular country in the EU that we all know is a rather important country. All right? Germany. All right? Another German economic miracle. That's taken from an article, the source is down below, by Rien and Zimmermann, just recently published in the Iseo Journal of Labor Policy. For those of you who don't know, Zimmermann is Klaus Zimmermann, professor of economics at Bonn, but he also is the president and head of the IZA, which is the principal institute that studies labor and macro issues, but particularly labor issues around the world, actually. And essentially this picture says that although Germany was affected by the recession, its exports were impacted for about a year, and there was a sharp decrease in the growth in GDP, about 4%. That returned, demand for exports bounced right back up. They were back on the growth path, and in fact growing after by 2010. And there's essentially no impact of the recession on unemployment in Germany. Yeah.
What's on the y-axis here?
What's on the y-axis? Oh, it's an index. So everything starts at 100% in 2008, okay? And then we're looking at the percentage change relative, relative baseline for each country. So what it says is that German employment has increased by 2%, U.S. employment has decreased by 5, decreased by more than that, but now it's 5% below, so forth. And UK is somewhere in between. All right? Okay, and now in that particular article, which I can recommend, there's a discussion of why that's true. And there's a lot, I have to admit, they're very fair about the impact of the recession, the Great Recession, on Germany in the following sense. Germany did not have a housing market bust, it did not have was not overly exposed to the financial crisis, all right? And they have a robust export, even the Chinese, particularly the Chinese like their BMWs, Americans do too. They have an export niche which is theirs, and they've buffered from a lot of problems there. And the authors of this article made a big point of that, or they certainly made that point. But they also made a big point of labor market policy reform in Germany that took place from 2003 to 2008 as being an important contributor. I have some objections to that argument, although it is true that it had an effect. But what I'm giving you this not so much as whether or not their argument is true. My point here is that this experience has conditioned German political economy in a particular way, and we need to understand that, to understand Germany's position on EU policy more generally. All right? They believe that their labor market reform saved them from the recession. All right? Many of them do. All right? And that explains why they're preaching reform to everybody else. All right? In a nutshell. Okay? All right. Back to this rise, post-recession rise in unemployment. Look at youth unemployment. All right? In percentage terms, that goes from 21 to 24% there on average. We're talking about from 9 or 10 to 12. It explains virtually all, not much of, not all, but much of the increase in unemployment. Okay. Let's unpack this a little bit more. Look at it by country. All right, now here, down on the bottom, I've got, again, 2000 to 2010, 2012. All right, from here.
Can you show us colors a little bit?
Right? I'm not going to. Hello, can you hear me? All right. 2010, or 2000 to 2012. All right. What are the colors? Now let me see if you can guess. How about this one?
Greece.
Greece. How about this one?
Spain.
Spain. How about this one?
Spain. Ireland.
Portugal. No, Ireland. I don't know. All right.
France.
Italy, I think.
France.
What? France is down, yeah, somewhere over here. What's this one? Germany. Made the point. Okay, what do the countries where all this is going up have in common? Come on. What do these countries have in common? Except for this one, per se. Financially distressed, right? There's one over there too. All right. What kind of policy has been recommended for them? Austerity. All right. Austerity. Okay. Now you got the point, right? There seems to be a lot of differences in the unemployment experience across countries, and that's associated with financial distress on one hand and the subsequent austerity programs of the IMF and so forth, I guess the EU has imposed. We look at the picture, we look at growth rates, you know, we got a similar dismal picture in the sense, even relative to the US. The EU 17 is the blackest line. Again, we're going from 2000, in this case 2005 first quarter to 2010 fourth quarter across there. You see, this is a quarterly annualized rate, I guess. EU growth rates turning down in 2012. This is just the change in unemployment rate versus change in GDP. The red dots are along the horizontal. You have differences in GDP growth rates. Right, the zeros out there. I'm sorry, along the horizontal. Yeah, along the y-axis, the horizontal, the vertical. I'll get it right. We have differences in unemployment rate. All right. So this is simply the last year we have data, 2011 and 2012. The red points are the EU countries. And they're, for the most part, characterized by, of course, decreases in GDP growth and increases in unemployment. The others, there's a selection of others. The United States is down over there. Jordan, for some reason, I'm borrowed this picture. Greece is way up in the far corner. All right. My suggestion is that, right, there's some policy influence going on here in terms of the unemployment experiences by countries, and that's extremely important. I don't know whether we want this. I don't have enough of the EU countries here, but this is just a picture to say, well, what has policy been generally in the developed world? Along the horizontal here, we have change in money supply. Along the vertical, change in government policy. Well, it's been expansionary monetary policy and contractionary fiscal policy, right? That's where virtually everybody is in there, with exceptions like, well, I don't know, Brazil, I guess, and then clear off on the left, Switzerland, which is Okay, so just to summarize where we are here, I'm going to come back to your question after the break. Unlike the U.S., EU unemployment rates increased sharply after the Great Recession. Increased unemployment has been borne primarily by the young in the financially distressed countries. All right. I suggest these facts call into question the efficacy of austerity policies, and certainly the experience is that monetary policy alone is not enough. All right. This is an issue which I haven't yet talked about. I've just alluded to, all right, labor market policy and the structure of labor markets. I'm going to put that off till tomorrow because that's the focal point of my discussion tomorrow. Will be on particularly youth unemployment and the structure of labor markets. My conclusion tomorrow is, yes, policy's been counterproductive since in EU since the recession. You simply can't do a recovery and also experience contractionary fiscal policy. However, I think there's an important interaction between the structure of labor markets on the one hand and how they react to contractionary fiscal policy. I think that's clearly indicated by the data. It's precisely those countries on the one hand that have experienced contractionary, for the most part, the countries experience contractionary fiscal policy, who have problems with the structure of their labor market. Spain, Italy, Greece, right? Where the reaction's been the largest, and the fact that the reaction's been the largest among youth is also an indicator that the structure of the labor market has contributed to the response in these countries to the fiscal tightening. Okay, what I want to talk about after the break are labor market trends. So we have some time now for some question and answer about this first part of the talk, and then I'll shift gears and talk about those trends because it's important, and we'll talk about those after the second. So, questions? Yeah.
Professor, in the United States, there's been a lot of discussion about the minimum wage issue, and a lot of people say that we should get rid of the minimum wage and people will retrain themselves, and it's trapping people in low wage and low skilled jobs. There are other people who say that raising the minimum wage might actually lower the burden on the unemployment insurance pool of money that the government has. So how do you feel about this?
Did everyone hear the question? Just to repeat it, the question's about minimum wage. All right, not a new issue. It's been always around a lot. But particularly in the context of the U.S., does it cause problems or is it the way to save the world? My personal, for the most part, historically, the minimum wage has had little or no effect in the U.S. It's just been too low. All right. The only effect has been on young people, and for the most part, what it's done, young people who are employed in the United States come in a couple of varieties. They're not all poor, right? Many of them are simply young, right? And working on part-time jobs or between terms at school and so forth. And for the most part, that's helped them, right? But for the vast majority of the labor force, it does not. But there's still a controversy about raising. One view is that it'll just cause more unemployment. That's the neoclassical view. You just look at a supply and demand curve and you can, of course, any of you are capable of generating that result. It's a I think that we're coming to realize that that's a very narrow view of what the unemployment rate does. The the minimum wage. The minimum wage also has a large effect, in some of the models I've been working on, you can easily show this. on the market power of the two sides, employers and employees. It limits the market power of the employers. And employers, although there's been a long argument that low-paid jobs is highly competitive. No, right? There's a lot of market power to go around, and that contributes considerably. And you can see that very clearly by the effect of the diminishing in the importance of the labor unions historically. All right, that certainly had an effect on not only wages but the labor share. Okay, so there's a large group, I admit, that none of them are in Chicago, other than maybe the north side like me, who will argue that that minimum wage can have a positive effect on a relatively small effect on employment and a positive effect on earnings. And I think in the European case, northern European countries show that. Although it's clear, since I also live part-time in Denmark, that the minimum wage there is sufficiently high that there are certain kinds of service jobs that just don't exist. All right, if you own a home there, you mow your own lawn. You paint your own house on your vacation. That's a long vacation by US standards, but in other words, there's a lot of home production going on because it's simply too expensive to buy those services as compared to the US. This is very clear if you've lived in both countries. So yes, there are unemployment effects at the bottom, all right, but the minimum wage has to be a lot higher in the US to see that.